It's so good to see you all here. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're really excited about our program tonight. And before we get there, I just wanted to acknowledge you all in being here and joining us to celebrate writing, to hear from our amazing guest speaker, Samir Pandya, tonight. This is our celebration, or at least the kickoff celebration of the CWPD's 10th anniversary. I can hardly believe it. Before we get started, I thought I'd share just a few thoughts on the CWPD, its legacy, what it means, I think, to all of us. And I hope that tonight's event, along with our speaker series this whole year, inspires you to embrace the idea that we're all writers together. The process and the practice of writing is, after all, it's foundational for CMC, for your time here, but it's really a crucial part of our shared humanity, and I hope that you can come to feel that along with me, certainly tonight and thereafter. Writing, according to Ross Gay, who is the author of our first-year summer book, The Book of Delights, as many of you know, is the weird path toward what you have come to know, which is called thinking, which is what writing is. For 10 years now, we at the CWPD have traveled alongside students, faculty, staff who are on that weird path where thinking and writing converge. Our shared journey over the past decade has been a true delight. Equally delightful is our wall of writing. How many of you saw that outside? Oh, if you haven't seen it, you really must go read some of the posts that are there from our alums and current students. It's lovely to see. I hope you noticed it. Go see it if you didn't. It's stationed just outside. And as I said, it features those perspectives of our alums and students for whom writing has proven to be truly transformative. In my response to the prompt, which was, how have you used writing to transform the world? I quoted 18th century novelist Samuel Richardson, whose correspondence with friends includes one of my favorite depictions of the power of writing. And he says this very simply: the pen makes distance presence. Think of that. The pen is this instrument that's capable of transforming space and time itself. It brings together all sorts of folk through the act of writing. The pen makes distance presence. Richardson knew from personal experience the challenge that distance and solitude could pose for individuals. His most well-known novels featured protagonists who are confined in small spaces, sometimes very small spaces, desperately seeking connection with their family and friends through the act of writing. Having experienced our own confinement of late, it strikes me that writing has served not just as a path, as Gay reminds us, but potentially also as a bridge, connecting us across physical and even virtual space, making distance presence even while we were apart, and of course now when we're together too. I've always imagined the CWPD as a place of transformation, where distance between a rough draft and final draft, perhaps, or between the stages of brainstorming and revision to final draft, where that distance becomes presence, a finished paper, or a polished presentation, or in some cases, even a completed thesis project. Any seniors out there? Completed senior thesis projects on the way. There's, to me at least, and I hope for you too, always been this really delightful magic present in our space, the magic of community, of collaboration, connection, creativity, generated by the exchange of ideas during consultation sessions, or by our workshops and events, or by our Apple Fellows travels and writing projects, or by our guest speakers, that somehow brings our ideas into focus and that enables us to present our ideas to others, that makes distance presence. It's fitting to be celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Center for Writing and Public Discourse in our beautiful Athenaeum together, this space that prompts all of us to be present and engage in larger conversations spanning distance, time, genres, disciplines, and even media. Though it makes for a rather long acronym, I'm kind of fond of it though, The public discourse part of our title reminds us that traditional writing, along with innovations in the area of communication that really would have boggled Richardson's mind, enables us all to be writers together. Tonight is just the first night of our extended 10th anniversary programming. I hope that you join us in the coming weeks for a speaker series that will keep us company as we walk together along that weird path that takes us from distance to presence. To say more about our upcoming speaker series, I am so happy to introduce my colleague, Professor Chloe Martinez, the program coordinator for the CWPD, who will give you a preview of what you can expect from the CWPD this year.
Thanks so much, Chrissy, and thanks to all of you for being here to celebrate with us. I'm so thrilled that Samir Pandya is here with us this evening. His novel, Members Only, is thought-provoking and funny and troublesome in the best sense. It stops you, it stays with you, and it makes you reconsider your assumptions. I'm so glad we have this time with him, and I think it's a perfect way to start off the year of programming with the CWPD. We have so much planned for this year. First of all, our Ath events in the fall, we have, with the collaboration of the Gould Center and the Ath, novelist Charles Yu coming on October 27th, and novelist and essayist Zadie Smith on November 3rd. In the spring semester, look forward to cartoonist Linda Berry, novelist Jen Acker, and the poet Cynthia Dewi-Oka. These are all going to be really wonderful events. We also have some great non-Ath programming coming up. The CWPD is bringing poet and essayist Ross Gay, whose Book of Delights many of you have read, for a 3-part virtual residency in the spring. As ever, we'll be hosting workshops, write-ins, thesis writing sessions, small group sessions with speakers. Finally, we have our new initiative, Writing Against Racism, which is part of the President's Initiative on Anti-Racism Faculty Fellowship. And we have already sponsored and will be sponsoring several more lunchtime discussions at which faculty from CMC and beyond will serve as guides for conversations about race and racialization in literature and helping us to think about literature as windows into thinking about race in America. Look out for all these events as they're announced. I hope you can join us, and thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Hi everyone, it is so lovely to see you all here tonight. There are 3 brief things I'd like to say before we begin about our health and policy guidelines. Number 1, please keep your mask on over your nose and mouth during the entirety of the program, and if you would like to take a drink of water, which many of us do often, we ask you to please step outside of the Eggert Dining Hall. The second thing is that we'll be having a Q&A period at the end for Samir Pandya, which is excellent. So please make sure that if you have questions, feel free to take out a notepad and write it down for the Q&A portion at the end. And if you're joining us over Zoom, please feel free to send in your questions and include your affiliation to the college, because we will be prioritizing students per usual at the Athenaeum. And lastly, please take this time, I should see everyone doing this, to take out your cell phones and make sure that they're silenced. Yes. I know, the wonderful request. And please ensure that there's no video or audio recordings by the audience, as they are strictly prohibited. But without further ado, I'll say some quick words on our excellent guest tonight. For one, I think Professor Pandya really speaks to what college campuses right now are struggling with, which is that college campuses are an extraordinary place of identity formation and expression. As all of us know, we focus on defining ourselves in our own heritage. We struggle with how others define us and how to interact with people who are different from us. That's something that we'll face here, but as we leave the colleges. And when it comes to race and identity, we need to follow our guests' actual policy, or not policy, but precedent, by moving away from a more restrictive and historical examination of the black and white binary to a more disruptive and reframing of identity. Samir Pandya includes the complications of South Asian identity, and not just being Asian American, because yes, there's more than one identity included in there, but also for everyone who is an international student, but at the colleges, who is multi-ethnic or multiracial, or struggles with different identity based off of class. Samir Pandya's work is truly revolutionary. So this has been the focus of Professor Pandya's work in Members Only, which is a novel that breaks through the traditional campus novel genre with a full and complicated Indian American protagonist that challenges us to engage in conversations about race and thrive even in discomfort. To say just a few words about Professor Pandya, because his extensive experience is truly fantastic. But he is an associate professor of Asian American Studies at UC Santa Barbara. He is a fiction writer and interdisciplinary literary and cultural studies scholar whose fiction and scholarship considers the question of cultural dislocation and racial identity among South Asian Americans. His first book, The Blind Writer, Stories and a Novella, was shortlisted for the Penn and Open Book Award and follows the lives of first and second generation Indian Americans living in contemporary California. His scholarly essays have been published in the Journal of Asian American Studies, South Asian Popular Culture, and more. And Pandya is also published widely in popular press, including The Atlantic, ESPN, the New York Daily News, among others. So this event, co-sponsored by the CWPD and Writing Against Racism Initiative, is truly honored to have Professor Samir Pandya as our guest tonight. Please give a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Maya. I really appreciate that. Thank you all for being here. Mic is okay? Good? Yes. You know, I've been saying this. I've driven through this campus before, through this whole area before, but the phrase, I have really genuine envy for you all that you get to spend your days here and your nights here. You know, I arrived here this morning around 11 o'clock. And I've taken a lot of time to just take a walk, and you know, I realize I've spent my entire adult life at college campuses, right? All sorts of public, private, all sorts of different ones. And you know, it's a particularly special time. And so I'm just happy that places like this exist and that you're all here. So thank you all. I'm gonna, if you kind of can go with me, I'm going to take about 45 minutes of your time. And what I thought I would do is I would give you a little bit for the first 20, 25 minutes or so, just a little bit of a background about my work and kind of how I arrive at this particular place. And then I'd like to spend the next 20, 25 minutes or 20 minutes reading to you from the beginning of this novel that I published last year. And afterwards, I would love to engage with you in Q&A. It is genuinely my favorite part of all of this. What I also want to say, and why this evening is very special to me, is my book came out in July of 2020, when, as you all know, we were engaged in other concerns, right? And you know, one of the pleasures of, after the pain of whatever the 10 drafts of revision you go through with a novel, is to be with your friends and to be with people in public. And this is the first time I've had an opportunity to read from this book in public, and so I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciate this invitation and the warmth that all of you have shown. First of all, let me start by thanking the Claremont McKenna College community for inviting me to come speak with you tonight and for being such gracious hosts. I want to thank Priya Junar and everyone at the Athenaeum, and in particular, I want to thank my friend Chloe Martinez, who I taught with years ago as I was making a transition from being primarily a literary and cultural studies scholar to the space I occupy now as both a fiction writer and a critic. Thematically, and I think Maya spoke to this, my work has primarily focused on the cultural dislocation and racialization of South Asian Americans. I've written on these issues through both fiction and scholarship, each rhetorical mode shaping and sharpening the other. As a fiction writer, I recognize the mystery at the heart of language. As a cultural and literary studies scholar, I use theory and evidence from literary and cultural texts to make a robust argument. Despite some of the difficulties of these rhetorical shifts, working at the intersection of fiction and scholarship has been extremely generative. allowing me to challenge disciplinary boundaries, to think about the epistemological limits of each approach, and perhaps for me, most importantly, to examine my thematic interests from the vantage points of both writer and critic. This evening, I would like to read to you the opening section from my novel, Members Only, which came out in the middle of 2020 as we were in the midst of the first months of the COVID pandemic and as we reckoned with our collective racial history. But before I read, I want to briefly discuss 3 moments, one historical, one literary, and one autobiographical, that together have directly and indirectly shaped my thinking on the idea of brownness, the space of the racial in-between that I explore in this novel. Let me say at the outset here that brownness is a historically and theoretically varied term. How the term is used in the context of Latinx history, for example, is very different from how I use it in thinking through the experiences of South Asians in America. For that matter, the valences of brownness differ among Muslim and Hindu South Asian Americans, particularly after 9/11. The divergent thematic trajectories of 2 of our more well-known novelists, Ayad Akhtar on one hand and Jhumpa Lahiri on the other, reflects this particularly well. This talk tonight, then, is not a theoretical exploration of brownness, but rather a working through of my own relationship to race, first as a critic and then as a writer, and the process of learning to finally write about it as a novelist. So, the historical example. On July 4th, 1913, a 20-year-old Punjab University student named Bhagat Singh Thind arrived in the United States. Over the following decade, he would attend Berkeley, work the lumber mills on the West Coast, join the US Army, get honorably discharged, and find himself at the center of a landmark Supreme Court case. In 1922, the Supreme Court had rejected Japanese-born Takao Ozawa's desire to be a citizen of the United States based on his Asian ancestry. The court used racial science to argue that Ozawa was not Caucasian and therefore ineligible for citizenship. The following year, Thind's case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. But this time, taking a cue from the Ozawa decision, Thind and his lawyer argued that he qualified for citizenship because he was from northern India. That is, he was ethnographically Aryan and therefore white. The court equally denied Thind's bid for citizenship. And instead of using the scientific argument it had with Ozawa, it argued, quote, that the common man would never assume that Thind was white. As a legal scholar, Ian Haney Lopez writes, comparing the rationales put forth in Ozawa and Thind suggests that the Supreme Court abandoned scientific explanations of race in favor of those rooted in common knowledge when science failed to reinforce popular beliefs about racial differences. The court's eventual embrace of common knowledge confirms the falsity of natural notions of race, exposing race instead as a social product measurable only in terms of what people believe, end quote. Over the years, I've thought about and taught the Thind decision many times as a literary scholar because it opens up a series of critical conversations. First, as Lopez notes, the case shows that the lens through which one approached the category of race in the early part of the 20th century, as scientifically based, shaped by popular opinion, or as a social construction, was up for significant and very consequential debate. Second, examining the documents around the case, the hefty brief written by Thind's lawyer, Thomas Mannix, the Solicitor General James Beck's response, and the court's majority decision is historically important because it seems to replicate in America in the 20th century the debates that occurred in India in the 19th century on how best the British should educate the citizens of its jewel colony. In India in the 1830s, Orientalists argued for Sanskritic education based on a connection between ancient Western and Indian texts. Liberals, on the other hand, argued for the importance of teaching Enlightenment thought on law, history, and science to their Indian subjects. These two opposing ideas traveled from India to America, just like Thind himself had made that same journey. While Thind's lawyer made an Orientalist argument about his Indo-Aryan roots, James Beck made a liberal argument about the limits of Indian assimilation. The Supreme Court's decision, written by then Chief Justice George Sutherland, has echoes of the liberal historian Thomas Macaulay's infamous Minute on Indian Education. In 1835, Macaulay wrote, "We need to," quote, "form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect." In 1923, Sutherland added, quote, "What we suggest is mere racial difference, and it is of such character and extent that the great body of our people instinctively recognize it and reject the thought of assimilation," end quote. Written nearly 100 years apart, both Macaulay and Sutherland were insistent on Indian racial difference. They both offer a limited invitation to the club. You can read our books, you can sound like us, and you can even fight for us, but you can never actually be us. While the case serves as one entry point into early Indian American racialized life, it is Thind himself that I've kept thinking about all these years since I first learned of the case. For him, gaining social, cultural, and political power meant aligning himself with whiteness, even as the court and the common man had no interest in that alignment. How did it feel to want to be part of a national community that wanted to hold him at arm's length? And what was his relationship, if any, to American blackness? Did he see himself in them and their struggle? Fast forward exactly 80 years after the Thind decision, and Jhumpa Lahiri has published her first novel, The Namesake, her follow-up to the Pulitzer Prize-winning collection of stories, Interpreter of Maladies. Early in the novel, our culturally liminal hero, Gogol Ganguly, the American-born son of Bengali immigrants to New England, holder of an undergraduate degree from Yale and a graduate one in architecture from Columbia, arrives at a party in a Tribeca loft decorated by the owner with, quote, African furniture and sculpture and masks. Here, Gogol lays his eyes for the first time on Maxine, a white woman who is, quote, spreading a generous amount of brie on a cracker and arguing with a man on the other side of the coffee table about a movie by Buñuel, end quote. Brie and Buñuel, metonymies of pretension in anyone's book, should be all the evidence Gogol needs to turn around and run away. But of course, he longingly looks at the slightly drunk woman, his male gaze refracted through Lahiri's writerly grace. Quote, her forehead is high and smooth, her jawbones sloping and unusually long. Her eyes are greenish, the irises encased by thin rings of black, end quote. The next morning, she calls him, and for their first date invites him to her place for dinner, telling him as a heads up that she lives with her parents. Gogol, having grown up with a very different set of rules about the interaction of dates and parents, wonders if they will mind and that perhaps he and Maxine should go elsewhere. Lahiri writes, but she, Maxine, laughs at this suggestion in a way that makes him feel vaguely foolish, end quote. Why on earth would they mind? Gogol's sense of his own foolishness may be vague to him, but it is certainly not vague to Lahiri. But in keeping with what is now her signature poetics of subtlety, Lahiri says no more. And yet, Maxine's laughter at Gogol's discomfort signals that Lahiri is up to something more. As Maxine and Gogol spend more and more time together, this is how Lahiri describes Gogol's relationship to Maxine's parents. Quote, from the very beginning, he feels effortlessly incorporated into their lives. It is a different brand from what he is used to. For though the Ratcliffes are generous, they are people who do not go out of their way to accommodate others. Assured in this case correctly, that their life will appeal to him. End quote. Wealth and cultural capital, working together, allow the Ratcliffes to occupy the center without any care for the ways or the discomfort of others. Their way is the only way. And yet, Gogol is a knowing recipient of the incorporation. The Ratcliffes are assured correctly, as Lahiri points out, that their life appeals to Gogol. Here, Lahiri attempts to distance herself from her protagonist. What is underlying these scenes with Maxine and the Ratcliffes is a marker of difference and power that Lahiri does not and will not explicitly name, and yet is clearly present: race. It is Maxine and her parents' whiteness working alongside their wealth, which allows them to occupy the center so effortlessly. Consider how Lahiri describes the way the Ratcliffes see Gogol when they first meet. Quote, "They're at once satisfied and intrigued by his background, by his years at Yale and Columbia, his career as an architect, his Mediterranean looks. You could be Italian," Lydia remarks at one point during the meal, regarding him in the candle's glow. End quote. Gogol's appeal lays in the fact that he is handsome, well-educated, and has a good quasi-artistic career. He is an acceptable, even alluring difference. As usual, Frantz Fanon has already considered the dynamic at play here, writing about the man of color and the white woman. Quote, and this is from Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, "The white man agrees to give her sister to the black, but on one condition: you have nothing in common with real Negroes. You are not black, you are extremely brown." End quote. Lydia likes Gogol because he's exotic in the right way. Italian is okay, and educated Italian is even better. Taken together, Tind and Lahiri help us understand the shifting salience of race in South Asian American life spanning many decades, before 9/11 once again reshaped the stakes of this conversation. Whereas in the early part of the 20th century, Thind was deemed incapable of assimilation, decades later, after Indians were allowed to be citizens, and after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965, and the early influx of skilled migrants arrived, and the rise of the model minority as an ideal of immigrant life, Gogol is not quite the marker of difference that Thind was. And yet, he still remains on the outside, a provisional citizen at the Ratcliffe's dinner table. As a critic, I understood all of this. I understood all of this. I could see all of this. And yet, as a writer, it would take me a little longer to make race the subject of my fiction, mainly because I thought I had a very different subject. In college, I gorged on a lot of Raymond Carver because all the cool kids were gorging on him. In fiction workshops, I wrote minimalist, Carver-inspired short stories, but they simply didn't work when they were populated by the Indian and the Indian American people that I knew. I graduated from college, and while I desperately wanted to get an MFA, I was too scared to make that sell to my immigrant parents. So I did the more practical thing and went and got a PhD in literature instead. The mid-1990s were a heady, exciting time to be in graduate school. The Edward Saids and Homi Bhabhas and Gayatri Spivaks were shifting the ground beneath our post-colonial feet. But what got me the most excited were the Indian novelists producing books at one heck of a clip. Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, Rohinton Mistry, Amitav Ghosh, Anita Desai, her daughter Kiran Desai, and on and on. They were all different writers, producing different books, but most of them were taking on one messy, exuberant, worthwhile subject: India. Its colonial history, its post-colonial dalliances, caste and religion, and nationalism and communal violence and borders. This was what I wanted to write. But at the same time, I was living out my American life, voting for presidents, learning and navigating color lines, understanding the insistent markers of class, reading Cheever on suburbia, Ellison and Morrison on race, and Roth on post-war Jewish life. I finished graduate school, took an academic job, and eventually left it, finally ready to make a go at writing fiction. And I did. I wrote and published a book of stories on Indian American immigrants in California. But I still felt like I needed to write my one big Indian novel. The problem, of course, was that I didn't know the place. I'd left when I was 8 and made some trips back here and there. I wrote and wrote at this novel, added and subtracted, and I couldn't really figure out why it was taking so long to complete, why its emotional heartbeat sounded so irregular. It's easy to see now what I couldn't see then. I didn't know that my actual topic was less about India and more about my memory of the place and what happens to those memories when history gets in the way. When I left India at 8, my sense of the place and the people took deep root in my head, a snapshot of a time and place. India, of course, moved on and changed as places do, producing hundreds and thousands of new snapshots. In the summer of 2017, I'd gotten a wonderful fellowship in which I lived and wrote in an Italian castle, which is as ridiculous as it sounds. I'd arrived thinking that Umbrian meals would do the trick in helping me finish the Indian novel. But from the very first morning I sat down at my new desk, I knew that I wasn't going to write that book. And I want to say, for the record, there were 500 pages that I couldn't make sense of. And it is sometimes, when you get that far, you just don't want to turn back. You think one more draft is what will fix it. And I think the hardest part of any of this kind of creative life, whether it's creative or scholarly, is knowing when to stop, right? And it was hard to know when to stop. A couple of months before, I had written the first chapter of something new, something contemporary, something that sounded like me and the California life I knew, something that was dipping a toe in funny. I sat at that desk thinking about Thind and his desire to be a part of a country that didn't want him, and Gogol's vague sense of foolishness about his very real feelings of difference. And I thought about the years that I had been trying to make myself into a writer, with the backdrop of 9/11, the short-lived exuberance of post-raciality in the Obama years, and the clear reminder during these past several years that the color line in America is thick, insistent, and in need of constant excavation. I didn't, however, sit down and think I would finally write on race. Starting with an idea, as the American novelist Flannery O'Connor writes, is one sure way to doom a story. Instead, I began writing about the life of a middle-aged Indian American man. And to write about him honestly meant thinking about the indignities of middle age and the beauty of tennis and the tennis court and the complications of campus life. It meant thinking about his presence and mine in the brown space between black and white that I had been avoiding for a long time, and how we talk about and don't talk about race now, and the ways in which colonial legacies become contemporary realities. To paraphrase the Trinidadian novelist V.S. Naipaul at the end of his magisterial, The Enigma of Arrival, quote, "That was when, faced with this changing world and this new wonder about men, I laid aside my drafts and hesitations and began to write very fast about Raj Butt and his very bad week," end quote. It became, in the end, a novel about my American life in the shadow of the 2016 presidential election, infused with an India that can't seem to remain in the past. With all of that said, I'd like to read to you first the opening pages and then a bit from deeper in the first chapter. So when I was sitting, I had these 6 weeks to work. We had young kids, and it was this, and young kids are exhausting and lovely, but exhausting. And so I'd gone and gotten this fellowship, and there were other fellows who were older, who were all in a similar boat as me, which is they just needed to get work done. And then there were younger folks who were like, let's go to Rome for the weekend. And those of us who were kind of needing this 6 weeks, I think just stayed put, all right? And what I did was there's a corkboard, and this novel that I was telling you about that I had so much trouble with was a span of 30 years, and I just couldn't do 30 years. So for this book, I picked a week, which is a little bit easier to do. And I put, on a corkboard, I put Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I wrote down notes as they kind of occurred to me for each of these days, and just went at it, right? And a lot of you have asked about kind of the writing process, and one of the things I've consistently said is just try to kind of remove all the other noise, and whatever is coming, you can fix later, right? But the download initially is really important when your critical voice is not saying to you, this sounds dumb, or this is amazing, right? It's when you think something is amazing is when you really have to get rid of it. So I'm going to kind of begin, the section it's a Sunday evening. We were just starting our third night of interviews, and I felt the kind of weariness that comes from having wasted time. Raj, I said, introducing myself to the first couple. The man was wearing a casual half-sleeve shirt, and his wife was refreshingly unremarkable. In a loose dress, her hair in a simple ponytail. I liked them for it, but only for about 10 seconds. Raj, the wife asked, leaning in. It was a question I had been asked too many times in my life. Raj, I exaggerated. As in Federer. I feigned a smile, unsure if she was joking. They moved on, introducing themselves to the rest of the membership committee. The committee, Suzanne, the efficient and disciplined chair, Stan, a balding 60-ish lawyer, Richard, a leather-skinned club pro, Leslie, a childhood friend of my wife, and I had a particularly difficult task. Over the course of 2 evenings the previous week, we had already spoken with 10 different couples about why they wanted to join the tennis club. Simple nouns elevated to proper noun status. Tonight, we would talk to still more and then choose 5 out of the total 15 to let in. The club had opened several decades before, in the early 70s, when couples were riding high from breaking rules in the 60s, and yet wanted to make sure their children knew how to slice a backhand properly. The original membership had been a mixture of old money and lawyers and doctors, all of whom downplayed the breadth of their bank accounts. But the past several years had brought the movie and hedge fund people who'd bought up the old estates and come driving into town in cars that were never more than a year old. As the town's gilding glowed ever brighter, the club, or the TC as it was known among members, had continued on. A simple place with 8 courts, a swimming pool, and a rustic clubhouse with worn wicker couches. No flat-screen TVs, no towel service. There was a soda machine that still charged 50 cents for a Coke. Simplicity was the brand, and the simpler it stayed, the more people wanted to join, perhaps to rub off some of their new money sheen. The membership committee was tasked with bringing in families that had some sense of that earlier understated ethos, as well as some of the newer sort who paid their monthly dues, but generally preferred to use their home swimming pools and tennis courts. My wife, Eva, had grown up coming here, her parents a little ambivalent about its clubbiness, and yet appreciative of that selfsame simplicity. When we moved to town, we had joined together, though both of us were concerned by how quickly we were losing our urbanity. I, in particular, had fought the idea of the place, though quietly, somewhere inside, I knew I had been drawn to its luster. But for me, tennis courts and swimming pools were meant to be public. I'd honed my tennis skills on Muni courts in the East Bay after my family had moved to California from Bombay. I was hazed into playing better by a group of Filipinos who worked the night shift at the post office, slept several hours in the morning, and then set up shop at the courts until they had to go to work again. In high school, I had secretly hated the kids on our team who, with their multiple freshly gripped rackets and unscuffed Nikes, went off to private clubs after practice for further instruction. They had at least one parent who came to all their matches, while my parents were always working. I could sense then the deeper differences between us, though I didn't yet have the language to articulate them, or the experiences with which to understand them. But somehow, now, I'd grown to love belonging to my own club, or at least parts of it. I loved the late afternoon matches when the soft winter California sun lit up the surrounding hills in orange phosphorescence. I loved grilling meat with our friends while the children swam and swooped in for bites of hot dog. I loved diving into the pristine pool, swimming the length in one breath, and appearing at the other end, refreshed and alive. And most of all, I loved being there with Eva and our boys when the place was empty, hitting balls on a court and then jumping into the pool, the four of us, a perfectly self-contained pod. In most every way, the club was not so different from the club my family had belonged to before we left Bombay. We joined a gymkhana, one of the many clubs that had originally been made for British colonials, but later, by the time we were members, were populated mostly by Bombay's upper middle class, after my father had gotten a big promotion. That was where I'd swum in a pool for the first time, and after swimming, I'd lounge in the comfortable, dilapidated clubhouse with a mango lassi and a vegetable Frankie. I'd easily blended into the background at the gymkhana, not so much at the TC. I'm going to fast forward several pages. They begin this interview process, and Raj in particular is interested as a member of this committee in diversifying a very undiverse kind of membership space, right? And with that said, the last couple of the evening come in. Here they are, she said. Here they are, Suzanne said. Suzanne is the membership chair. Here they are, Suzanne said. Two couples walked into the clubhouse. The blacks, of course, were white, but the browns, who they were sponsoring, were black. I looked at the handsome couple and breathed a sigh of relief. It was as if an alternate, younger version of the Obamas had just walked in. I glanced at the committee, all of them looking at the alt-Obamas with big, friendly grins. The room was completely silent. We could hear the circadian murmur of kids finishing up at the pool outside. Let me introduce you to Doctors Bill and Valerie Brown, Mark Black said. Bill was roughly 6 feet tall and fit. He was wearing lean, perfectly fitting khakis, loafers, but a button-down light pink shirt and a navy blue wool blazer. I had recently read an article somewhere about how every man needed a perfect navy blue blazer. Bill's certainly was that. On one of his right wrists was a bracelet of Tibetan prayer beads, and on the other, a blue-phased octagonal Audemars. I placed my hand on my stomach and sucked it in a bit. I wish I went to the gym more often, got my shirts pressed more regularly. Valerie was a tall, striking woman who stood comfortably on her own, close enough to be intimate with her husband, but not subsumed by him. The Brown sponsors were Mark Black, a well-regarded cardiologist in town, and his wife, Jan. Mark had the confidence that comes with being able to slice open chests. I didn't see him on the courts often, but when I did, his strokes were compact and tidy, his body always moving instinctively in the right direction. He struck me as a little uptight, always appropriately dressed for whatever occasion he was attending. I don't think I'd ever seen his toes, which was noteworthy given the fact that one of the only things we had in common was access to the same pool. Jan was pretty and put together, her prettiness perhaps enhanced by all the time and money she had to take care of herself. They were a family obsessed with being on the cutting edge of trends. They bought Range Rovers, his in black, hers in white, while most people were stuck in their Audis. Jan took the family to spend the year in Spain so their kids could get used to playing on real red clay before everyone was taking a year off and calling it a sabbatical. Once I overheard Mark say that his shoulders were sore because he'd been skeet shooting the day before. I genuinely thought he was kidding until I realized he wasn't. Who goes skeet shooting? Perhaps everyone soon enough, if the blacks continue to have their fingers on the upper middle class pulse. The Browns went around the room, shaking hands with all of the committee members. When they came to me, they lingered for a few extra seconds, their eyes asking for help, managing what was clearly an awkward situation. A room full of white people deciding whether they wanted to let a black couple into their club. "I'm here for you," I tried to say as I reached out my hand to shake theirs. "Rajesh Bhatt. Everyone calls me Raj." "I knew a Raj in college," Bill said, smiling. I think everyone knew a Raj in college, except, of course, the woman from earlier in the evening. Bill had a deep, calming voice, one you might hear on a TV commercial for a Mercedes sedan. I think he runs Google now or something. "I use Google," I said, returning his smile. "Can we get you anything?" Suzanne asked. "Water would be great," Bill said. I happened to be the one closest to the table with the drinks. Suzanne glanced at me for the slightest beat of a second. I looked at her as Bill looked at me. "You know, how about a sip of something stronger instead?" Bill said, moving toward the table. "I'll get it." I stepped over to the table with him. "What do you like?" he asked, examining the open bottles of white and red. I sensed that he knew his way around labels. I reached for a lone, half-full bottle of nearly translucent Pinot tucked behind the mineral waters. This is the high-end stuff. They seem happy. Bill took 2 clear plastic cups from a stack. I gave us both a liberal pour. Bill took a small sip and then turned to me and said, "It certainly is." Our backs were turned to the rest of the group. Bill ate a dried apricot. I had a piece of salami, and we both took another sip. Before placing the bottle back, I poured us a little more of the wine. "Shall we?" I asked. Bill took his wine in one hand and a bottle of water in the other. He handed the water to his wife and took a seat next to her. I sat down on the couch facing them. For a moment, I wondered whether Bill was originally from the Caribbean. If he was, he would have grown up with Indians. Maybe he had a grandfather who had arrived on the island as an indentured servant, worked through his contract, and decided to stay instead of going back to the small Indian village he barely remembered. Maybe somehow, over the years, the butt had changed to brown. If that was the case, I mused, going back several generations, Bill and I could well be cousins. Since Eva and I had joined the TC, I'd slowly learned the rules of places like this, what games to join, when to engage in conversation, when to say nothing, never to ask what someone did for a living. I'd made plenty of tennis friends, but I hadn't met anyone with whom I felt simpatico. I wanted Bill to be that guy. He and I were different kinds of doctors, but certainly he'd have some appreciation for my doctorate, in contrast to most of the rich knuckleheads I met here, who probably thought of Indiana Jones when I said I taught cultural anthropology at the university in town. I'd not been getting many invitations to matches lately. I couldn't understand why. My game had continued to improve. I'd begun to wonder if they'd realized finally that I didn't fully fit in, that when they talked about the vacations they were going on to Marrakesh or Fiji, I usually pretended to be adjusting the strings of my racket. But maybe Bill and I could play. "We've read all of these wonderful letters of support you have," Suzanne said, holding up their file. You're so new to the area, and yet you've obviously made a lot of friends and set your roots quickly. Why don't you tell us about yourselves, your family, and your interest in tennis?" I'd read the file, which had letters from the Blacks and several other members attesting to how wonderful the Browns were. As I was reading the letters, I could sense something different about them, but I couldn't pinpoint it. Now I knew that they were a master class in colorblindness. The Browns were friendly and laid back. The phrases "they'll fit right in" had been used in 3 different letters. "Where shall we start?" Valerie asked. "Wherever you like," Suzanne said. Bill and I met in medical school in San Francisco, and we went to Boston to do our residencies. Bill in cardiology, me in trauma surgery. We both grew up in Los Angeles, just a few miles apart, but we never knew each other. I wanted to know which part of LA they'd grown up in, but I didn't ask. Inglewood, always up to no good. Perhaps Baldwin Hills. After winters and residencies that lasted far too long, we realized we missed the sun, the oak trees, and the huge congested freeways, Valerie continued. So when the opportunity opened up at the hospital, we jumped at it. We're less than 2 hours from our families in LA, and the community here has been very welcoming to us. Our sons are also showing some interest in tennis, and Mark can't say enough about how much he loves this place, so it seemed like the right fit for us. As she spoke, Valerie made careful eye contact with everyone in the room. She knew exactly how to make a room full of strangers feel comfortable as they gawked at her, trying to piece together her beauty, all her fancy degrees, the fact that every day when she went to work, she kept death at bay. "How old are your sons?" I asked. 8 and 5, Valerie said. Perfect, I thought. They'll be fast friends with my own. "Boys are fun, but they can be complicated," I said. "Yes," Valerie said. "Yes, they can." I sensed from the inflection of the second yes that raising boys for them was going to be a particular kind of complication, similar to, but ultimately different from the one Eva and I would experience. As our boys grew older, I talked to them about the dangers of driving while brown and how they would not always get the second chances some of their classmates would get. But Bill and Valerie would have to have this conversation on a much higher, far more sobering level. "I'm glad your kids are interested in the game," Suzanne said. "What about you two? We have a strong competitive interclub team you could play on." Bill and I had our first date on a tennis court, and I've hit the ball around with him since, but it'll be a while until I'm game ready. Eva and I had also had our first tennis date. I didn't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I could imagine a regular doubles match in our future. The women's interclub matches were on Wednesday mornings, and most of the other women we'd interviewed were eager to play, especially because the TC had won the interclub championship for the past 2 years running. "I'm sure Wednesdays are busy at the hospital," Leslie interjected, distinguishing Valerie from all the women we had interviewed who didn't work. "Yes, Wednesdays are tough," Valerie said, "but Bill is a tennis player in the family anyway." She placed her hand on her husband's knee, handing the ball over. "I played some in college," Bill said, a little too matter-of-factly. I sensed Bill was downplaying his level. Stan jumped in. "Where?" In every interview, the only time Stan spoke up was when there was a mention of a college. He'd ask about it, and without missing a beat, talk about Williams, how he'd played fullback there, read philosophy, and went on to Harvard Law School and settled into a life of contracts. Stan was lean and the veteran of 2 shoulder surgeries, brought on by several decades of playing tennis 4 times a week. Before this whole interviewing process had started, I'd had no opinion of Stan. I'd seen him around, always getting off the court with an ice pack balanced on his shoulder. But at the start, Suzanne had asked everyone on the committee about their vision of these interviews. Everyone, including me, had said this and that about considering the past to forge the future. And then there was Stan. "I've thought about it," he said, "and I've realized I don't have a vision. I just want high-level tennis players. Bad tennis offends me. This is a tennis club." A few days earlier, I'd seen him sitting in the hot tub reading a tattered copy of Don Quixote. When I asked him about it, he said he was rereading all the books that he had loved as a young man to see if they still hooked him in the same way. I'm trying to remember who I was back then. Stanford, Bill said, responding to his question. I wasn't the human U.S. News and World Report annual college ranking that Stan was, but I knew how to translate played some at Stanford. Bill was very good, like heavily recruited in high school and nationally ranked good. John McEnroe had played some at Stanford. Were you there with Tiger Woods? Richard asked, suddenly perking up. Richard wasn't a member, but traditionally one of the senior pros sat on the membership committee, perhaps to make it seem like the process was more equitable. He and I were both in our mid-40s, but working under the blazing sun had prematurely aged him. In fact, I was, Bill said. I was just glad that he wasn't on the tennis team as well. That's it, I thought. Don't ask him any more about Tiger. I was sure that at this point in his life, Bill must be tired of answering questions about Tiger just because they were vaguely alike. What was he like? Stan asked. Did you take any classes with him? I didn't. I was stuck in bio and chemistry. Bill and Valerie made the slightest eye contact. What did Tiger study? I asked, wanting to turn the conversation away from whether Bill had known Tiger towards Tiger alone. Somehow that seemed better. I'm not sure, Bill said. Econ, maybe? He was only there for a couple of years. Clearly, he didn't need to take any more classes. He figured out macroeconomics all on his own. I couldn't contain my grin. So, did you both always want to go to medical school and become doctors? I asked, moving us away from Tiger entirely. The main purpose of these brief interviews, some as short as 10 minutes, was to let the prospective members talk so we could get some sense of them. The due diligence was performed in the letters and in whispers. I did, Valerie said. My father is a doctor, so it was assumed that I'd go into the family business. I couldn't imagine doing anything else, and I still can't. I thought about other things, Bill said. I flirted with law school, but it didn't feel quite right. As usual, Bill's being a little modest, Mark interjected. Throughout the interview, he'd sat there self-satisfied, like he'd brought the fatted calf to the banquet. He decided to forego the tour to go to medical school. This bit of information dazzled the men in the room. They all seemed to lean in toward Bill at that moment. I suddenly felt sad about the state of both my game and my career. I'd done just enough to get by at both. Bill, on the other hand, had excelled and had the freedom to choose between two enviable options. That's not exactly how it went, Bill said. I played in a few professional tournaments and lost in the early rounds. I couldn't deal with the uncertainty of it all. But the fact is that I haven't had much time in the past 15 years to keep up with the game. Medical school and then residency and kids didn't leave time for doubles. But I was thinking that I'd get back out there a little more now, get rid of the rust, at least if Mark doesn't work me too hard at the hospital. Bill's mention of work got me thinking about my own. I had papers to grade before the next morning. I'd grab a burger after this to soak up some of the wine swirling around in my head. And by the time I got home, I hoped the kids would be asleep. I felt exhausted from all this talking and smiling. Bill added, "It'll take me some time to catch up with you all." I bit at my lower lip. I have a tendency to mouth words to myself before I actually say them, as a way of testing out the safety of what I'm about to say, something I'd learned from lecturing. Sound out the joke before letting it loose. But this time, maybe because I was distracted, maybe because I was so desperate to show Bill that we could be on the same team, that I understood where he was coming from. As I mouthed the words, the complex mechanism that occurs between air and tongue and throat to create sound did its job against my deepest wishes. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Professor Pandya. Thank you so much. At this point, we will be taking Zoom questions as well as in-person questions. For the sake of time and for social distancing, we will have people line up at a microphone, or you can raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you. But the microphones will be at this end of the room as well as over there. So if you have a question, you may go ahead and line up or raise your hand, and then we will be taking the Zoom question as well. When you ask your question, please remember to state your name, your year, and your major when you introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, as we met, I'm Maya. I'm
Hi,
one
Maya.
of the Ath Fellows this year. I'm a senior. And my question for you is more generally on the writing process.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit twofold. First, how do you know when you've reached your conclusion? And then how do you know when to end your rewriting and editing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a teacher in college, a really terrific short story writer named Elizabeth Talent, and she had this great piece of advice that when you think you're done, write one more paragraph, right? And this idea that there is always a kind of a further place you can go to, right? And it doesn't mean you're going to go to that place, right? But it's almost like an exercise that you engage in to kind of figure out if there's something more to be done, right? So so the first question was when you know that you're over. What was the second thing, which was?
How do you know when to stop writing and rewriting?
Yeah, I think when you physically feel sick, you know, and I do, and I say that a little glibly, but honestly, the really hard part about writing a book is you're genuinely sick of the thing roughly 2 to 3 years before it is done, right? And so there is, and I'm not saying this to kind of suggest that you don't do it, but it is just the nature of it, right? It is, a book is like, is a distillation of so much various thinking that you have done, right? And so I think what ends up, in my case, what ends up happening is you just can't do it anymore, right? And I do think, and this is where friends help, right? And friends can say, I think you've had enough, you've done all you can do, right? And in this case, you know, I had 5 different friends who read through it and gave me thoughts, and then I thought it was complete, and then an agent decided to take it on. He had revisions for me, so I revised it, and then we sold it, and I went through 3 full-scale revisions with the editor that bought the book, right? So when in 2018 I thought I had reached my emotional limit with this book, was in fact not my emotional limit with it, right? And so it took another 1.5 years to do it. So that's, I do think this whole notion that you just sit there and write this thing is just not the case, right? Friends, and you know, and you don't need that many readers, but you need a couple of people that you trust for them to be able to say, this is something you should keep doing. And then also for them to feel comfortable enough at a certain point to say, you know what, I don't think this is working in the way it should work. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Banu. I'm a freshman. So earlier in the talk, you mentioned Ayad Akhtar and Jhumpa Lahiri.
Yeah.
And so in both Akhtar's Disgraced and Lahiri's Namesake, they explore the concept of South Asian men in relationships with white women.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like that's the case in your novel too. And
Yeah.
so I wanted to ask about how you, as a brown man writing this novel, explored and like fought with that intersectionality and how you may have internalized certain systems in the book.
Internalized what?
Certain systems like
So,
the
yeah,
patriarchy
no,
and whatnot.
it's an interesting question, right? Is because, of course, Ayad Akhtar, in, you know, both in Disgraced and this new book, Homeland Elegies, is, I think, dealing with this issue, right? And look, this is an interesting, it's an interesting question, right? And I think that what I'm going to do, if you can allow me, is move away from me for 1 second and deal with this character that I spent a significant time working through, right? Which is that when Raj Bhatt arrives in California in the early 80s, there are very few other Indian people living in the Bay Area where he moves to, right? And I think that at a certain level, there is when there are not others around, right? Your own sense of social capital you see in kind of the people that do not look like you, right? And I think that for Raj, in particular, kind of the generational difference between him growing up in the 80s and going to high school in the 80s versus growing up in kind of the aughts, right, when the immigration practices have changed significantly, is very, very different, right? Now, so that is kind of one piece of it. Now, what is really interesting about you bringing up the Lahiri novel is he is with Maxine in the beginning, and that relationship is doomed. And then he is with Moshmi in the second half of the book, and that relationship is doomed, right? And so if Lahiri was interested in saying, here is one set of relationships that work and another set that do not, right? That would be one kind of argument. Lahiri, in a certain way, is far more cynical in that book, right? And far more melancholy, where she says that, you know, that moment where he moves to Moshmi is precisely for this kind of internalized critique that you're talking about, right? Gogol says, have I been around white people too long? Do I need to go with my own people? He goes with his own people, and it turns out to be even a bigger disaster than he had with Maxine, right? So that is kind of a lot of the social context in which all of this is occurring, right? But you're also just asking a question that I don't know really how to answer, right? Which is, how do people get attracted to one another, right? I don't, that's way above my pay grade, right? And there is a way in which I think I totally agree with you, right? In so much South Asian representation, and we can go down the list, right? Master of None, same issue, right? All of these sects, Mindy Kaling, same set of issues, right? This happens over and over again, right? And so I think that there is a way in which the critic in me completely agrees with the reading that you're doing, right? But the other part in me, which is in some ways trying to figure out what domestic relationships look like across racial lines, recognizes that there is not a post-racial space there, but it's a completely negotiated space, right? And I simply don't have a real clear answer for it, right? Like I can tell you that there has been a problematic kind of way in which it has been done, but for me as a particular writer, there was always something kind of that I've been, you know, later in the novel, the two characters talk about the fact that he's married to her, right? And kind of what that means and how, and so I try to flesh through that, but ultimately there's also for me a mystery in how those kind of relationships operate as well. So thank you for that question. It's a hard one, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, my name is Zarina, and I am a junior transfer student here. I first wanted to acknowledge how incredible it feels to have this representation on my new campus, so thank you for that. And then I was wondering, what is the most beautiful hidden detail you found while reviewing your drafts, and how did that change your perspective of your past?
So if I hear your question correctly, what was the most beautiful detail that I found in the drafting? And why that detail was important to me?
Yes.
Oh my God, that is a crazy, it's a terrific question. I promise I will come up with a detail.
Okay.
You know, and this is purely autobiographical, right? Is you know, one of the reasons I had a regular job. I had an academic job, and sometime in the middle of having this academic job, that I was a little uncertain about. My father passed away, right? And he had worked very hard. He had kind of he'd moved to this country when he was 47 years old, right? And completely remade himself and done quite well for himself. And then 2-3 years after he retired, he passed away, right? And suddenly, I had a classic mid-30s crisis, which is things happen when you don't want them to happen. I quit this job that I had, kind of moved across country, and began to make myself into a novelist, right? And in a way, this novel, as much as it is about race and as much as it is about belonging, it is very much about the relationship Raj has with his father, and the way, not that Raj, the father haunts him, but the presence that he has in his life, right? And so if there is one detail that I took directly from my own life and placed in here, was in one of the very few, vacations that he thought it was okay for him to take. My entire family and I went to Kauai, and I had never seen him in a bathing suit before, right? It was, that is not who we were, and that is not who he was. And he put on a bathing suit, and we went snorkeling. And I think in some ways, it was the most intense, intimate time he and I had ever spent together, which was underwater, right? And there was this moment where there were all these fishes around, their turtles, and it was just him and I. And that moment had kind of emotionally stuck with me for so long. And, there were 2 or 3 images in my mind that I had when I began writing this novel that I wanted to get in. It was that detail, and it was a detail that I totally made up, which was this kid making a Ganesh out of paper mache and his Adderall bottles, right? And I just needed to figure out how to get those 2 images in there, right? And so that was just the one detail that I think, I didn't know where it was gonna go. I was hoping really, desperately that the editor was not gonna suggest that it get cut out, but she kept it, and I think that was, an important one. It's a great question, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor. My name is Miriam Farah, and I'm a junior at CMC. First, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And my question is about your book. So from what I've heard, your characters are more on the wealthier side as they're doctors. And I was wondering about your decision to make them wealthy, and whether your book addresses the intersection of race and class, why or why not?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a terrific question. If you remember, one of the places that I had ended was, where he says, I felt comfortable at the Gymkhana, which is basically the version of the TC in colonials in India, but I didn't feel as comfortable at the TC, right? And it's a really terrific question, because so much, when I wear my kind of scholarly hat, when I teach immigrant novels, right, so much of the narrative of immigrant novels is you come from poverty, you arrive in this country, you make something of yourself, right? That is the narrative arc of those novels. What I was really interested in was a very different experience, which is what happens when you have certain, in this case, both class and specifically caste privileges in the places that you are from, and you immigrate and you lose all of those caste and class privileges, right? And that in some ways is kind of what Raj is thinking, that everyone at this club assumes that he didn't grow up in places like this, where in fact he grew up precisely in places like this, right? So on one hand, that was part of the reason I was invested in him occupying this space, right? The second thing is I make Raj into an anthropologist because for me, in a certain way, this feels like the ethnography that he writes about wealth, right? And how that in some ways, this is very much a book about race, but what Raj notices is the $10,000 watch that Bill Brown is wearing, right? What Raj notices is he says he sounds like he's speaking out of a Mercedes commercial, right? So Raj himself is deeply status conscious and deeply anxious about the fact that he does not have the kind of status that he wishes he had, right? And so I think both of those things were specifically important, right? Which is that I wanted to kind of think about, what the TC here is a very liberal space, right? And I think what I was interested in is what happens in liberal spaces when in those spaces everyone is post-racial and everyone hides their markers of class, right? And I think what the TC then ends up being is very non-post-racial and very much engaged in a certain kind of class showiness and a class kind of outward exuberance over it. And so that is kind of what I was trying to work through there.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful questions. And please give another round of applause to Professor Pandya, who made such a wonderful presentation tonight. And to conclude tonight's presentation, a few words from President Chodosh. Thank you so much.
First, a really heartfelt thanks from all of us to you, Professor Pandya. You were an outstanding choice on the evening of the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Center for Writing and Public Discourse. I know the hour's late, but I want to tell you a quick story, and I just want to make 3 points in celebration of the evening. When I started college, my university correctly identified me as semi-literate based on the very poor education that I got in my public high school, and put me into a remedial program for 3 weeks. And it was one of the best things that they ever did for me. And one of the techniques that they taught me, which sticks with me to this day, was we were handed a book that we hadn't read. And we were asked to read only the title of the book. And we were told that we were the author of this book. And we were to construct an argument, if it was a work of nonfiction, if it was a work of fiction, then a story. And we were to develop an argument, what the evidence would be, an outline, and basically write notes as if we were the author of this book. And 2 wonderful things would happen after then reading the book. One, we might have anticipated just a little bit of the book, and that was very empowering, because through the sheer force of our imaginations, we could imagine what an author with this title would write. A second thing would happen more frequently. We'd be completely surprised by the story or the argument or the evidence launched. And it turned us all into very active readers. But it was very empowering because it said to us, we were the authors, that we didn't necessarily have to defer to what we were writing. We could co-author in parallel with the text that we were reading. And I mention that tonight because I think at CMC we are trying in every way to turn each of you into your own authors and getting a glimpse not only of some great writing, but a very thoughtful author's inside account of that writing is a special privilege, and thank you for sharing that with us. 3 points. One, the great scholar Harari from Israel, who wrote the book *Sapiens*, which was a tremendous synthesis of a lot of other scholarship, argued that social cooperation was our key for survival. And there were 2 things that Homo sapiens developed that are the basis for us having survived so long. It wasn't our physical strength and it wasn't our brain size. It was gossip and fiction. Gossip because it engaged us in judgments about personal relationships, and that was useful to our survival. And fiction because fictions, and I don't mean just stories, I mean concepts like nation and human rights and corporation and other ideas that allow us to coordinate more than 150 people at a time across many differences. That these were the core reasons for the success of our species on the earth. And that's all to say that writing, discourse, is not just important for your own development, it's actually important for the survival of us on this planet. And so it's also true that good writing as so essential to our survival, requires good coaching. Atul Gawande, who was here on the first night of the AF, in addition to his other books, wrote a wonderful book about coaching. And he said that coaching is the most transformative human intervention ever developed to improve human performance. And that's why we celebrate the Center for Writing and Public Discourse. And I want to especially thank, who's not here, Audrey Bilger, who's currently the president at Reed College, for having founded the center. And of course, Chrissy Crockett, Melissa Martinez, Chloe Martinez, Megan Gallagher, all of the tremendous student coaches and consultants who are all engaged in the most transformative intervention on the most vital media of social cooperation. So I want us all to sort of step back from the particular to celebrate that. And then finally, this all begs the question of what is good writing? When I was studying theater in New York, my theater teacher told me that Maupassant was very famous, and there was this writer who camped outside his house for weeks on end, wanting to meet him just to ask the question, how do I become a great writer? After many weeks, finally, Maupassant appeared, and the writer was able to pose this question to him. And Maupassant in this story picked up a stone and said, when you look at the stone enough, and you find something to say about the stone that no one else in the world has ever said, that is when you know you've become a good writer. And so, in summary, remember that writing and discourse and communication is vital to our survival, that to coach and be coached is the most transformative intervention that you can engage in, and to make sure that when you pick something to write about, that you listen, as our great presenter did here tonight, to your own internal voices, to self-author your own text. And that is the way we move forward and survive and thrive in the world. So thank you all for being here tonight. Thanks to the AF, and congratulations.